Um, I might just skip this one for time. Just to say, well, if cities are opportunities for change, then how do we go about doing it in a system where commercial interests really hold the power? And I think that's something that often we can kid ourselves or we can overlook in these kind of debates. But if you think about the power of the supermarkets and the power of the market in terms of preventing politicians from regulate. The question is, how do we develop change in a system where a lot of the stakeholders are interested really have very little power? So, and that's where the strategic approaches come in, which I'll briefly go through in a minute. The strategic approaches are aimed at bringing together, the ones I'll talk about are aimed at bringing together different stakeholders and different interests in urban food systems in a way to combine their resources, their energy, and be more effective in theory. And I just want to make quickly this first point here about advocacy groups around food. That you can kind of classify them into two areas, I think. First, advocacy groups like organic and veganism and these kind of sustain, Soil Association in the UK, who primarily aim to change the food system globally. But in recent years, we've also had a growth in numbers of groups, a number of people who aim specifically at the impact of the food system in their local area, and this is a different type of advocacy and community activity that provides opportunities if they can be tooled up, for want of a better word. Oh, I don't know what changed. So this graph, I think if you were to plot that, it would be quite similar to the rural and urban population graph I showed just now, that the number of local groups compared, number of advocacy groups interested in their local areas is actually growing faster than these global issues. I hesitate to ask. And the reason why strategic approaches to food are important, as quite obvious really, is the complexity and vitality of the food system, and also the uncertainty surrounding what will happen in the future. And I'll just fill in that in the next slide then. I'll briefly go through this because people before me have spoken a bit about food policy earlier, but just to kind of characterise it, we've seen an evolution in food policy in recent decades in the UK and Europe and elsewhere, from a system where food policy used to be the remit at national government at the national level, and it was essentially about producing enough food. Over recent years, we've seen a broadening out of what food policy is and who gets involved in it. So, international level, at EU level, and also local, regional levels, and also in terms of who gets involved in food policy. It's no longer the remit of national government and one or two, and a small number of multinationals through lobbying, There's also broader private interests and also community groups and NGOs, as you'll all be aware. And also at the same time, what food policy has broadened out from the question about production and producing enough food to food security, but a more nuanced understanding of food security, you could argue, and also environmental, health, safety, quality and social issues around food policy. And my point here really in regards to this city is that this broadening out, both in terms of the scope and the scale of what food policy is, provides opportunities for alternative approaches that perhaps were not there 30, 40, 50 years ago, and spaces for cities and other localities to get involved and decide or help to influence food in their area. So then briefly, just to go through the strategic tools that we're currently witnessing in the UK within cities and also towns and other geographic areas. categorise them into three areas: food strategies, food charters, and food policy councils. And I'll quickly go on to summarise all three. Food strategies, obviously, as a lot of people will be aware, they exist at various levels, from global down to very local groups, and also there are one or two in the private sector, groups of private businesses coming together. They came to the fore really, well, in the UK, I guess after the foot and mouth crisis at the turn of the century, but their peak, I guess, was around 2007, or the aftermath of 2007-2008 food crisis, and there we saw a whole raft of food strategies by various organisations. Evidently, they're defined by the fact that they're usually a physical document. They try and take a holistic approach to the geographical area that they're concerned with. They're either produced by different groups of stakeholders or through consultation with stakeholders, and they usually have a specific time horizon. And I had a quick count, and there's about 20, I would say, active food strategies within the UK at the moment. A similar tool is Food Charter, which is normally, and again there's about 20 of these in the UK as well, from cities and towns. It's a set of principles to try and define what the core core priorities are for a city or a region. Again, they've been usually developed through consultation with the various stakeholders, and the idea is that individuals, organisations, businesses, public institutions sign up to the pledges and commit themselves to behaving in a certain set of ways. And I'll go on to challenge the effectiveness of some of these in a second. The third area is food policy councils, although Food Policy Council is something that was born out of North America. The first one is widely recognised as being from Toronto about 25 years ago, something like that. And the first one to come to the UK was in Bristol in 2011. These are forums set up on a longer basis where groups of stakeholders can come and decide what are the priorities for their area, in this case cities. Food policy councils, we also have food partnerships and food boards and similar organisations in the UK that are used for this purpose and that predate the Bristol model but have different names. So just briefly, I'm going through this. I mean, it's difficult to argue that these processes are anything but a force for good. It's difficult, even if they're not effective, or they have problems in some ways. I don't want to say that people are wasting their time getting involved in these and communities have no chance, but I think I've observed that in my research, and there's literature, emerging literature on it, really questioning the effectiveness of many of these tools. And particularly, I've just tried to characterise some points here. First of all, their complexity, because they're trying to be holistic and tackle such a wide range of issues. The complexity can overpower them in terms of finding a focus. Lack of willpower, and I should have rephrased that really. There's a short-termism associated with these. A lot of it is political. You tend to see a strategy that comes up with one political administration and then they go out of office and another one replaces and then they want their own thing. And that's also true with other stakeholders and other individuals who can come and go, and perhaps it doesn't set out the long-term aims tend to get lost in the system. There's a chronic lack of resources associated with these initiatives, unfortunately, and the most successful ones are usually the ones that have had resources put into them, Toronto being an example, and London, which you'll hear about in a minute, has had success in that area. I come back to this issue of a lack of power. Community stakeholders in a city compared to the might of the supermarkets, retailers, large businesses, what effect can they actually have And then lastly, there's this issue of who decides within an area, within a community, and that's connected to the idea of food democracy. Why should one group of people be deciding what the citizens will experience, or the outlook for them compared to another one? So these are the kind of. And I think I'll end on this slide because I said I'd be quick. A couple of ex-colleagues of mine at Cardiff, Sanino and Spade, analysed some of these initiatives, specifically looking at food strategies, but also other urban food frameworks, and identified these 6 points of what makes a good framework and more effective framework in urban areas, as we're specifically looking at. So I'll just briefly go through them. There's a need for a clarity of vision to engage people. Policy should be comprehensive, as in cutting across different areas, so health, economic development, sustainability, social issues, etc. They analysed that those that stated clearly a need for change were important in terms of enrolling people that were not already convinced to the cause. Again, involving stakeholders provides more buy-in. And then I think importantly, the last 2 ones, mechanisms to evaluate and monitor process. It's amazing how often this issue is left out of strategic approaches. You can do a nice document, a nice set of pledges, and then there's nobody there or no resources to monitor and evaluate them. And I think this is one area where technology has a role in terms of providing data for the food system and people's consumption habits. And it's something that to make these tools more effective and more credible, really, people need to, that should be the top of the list, really, in my view. And then change, we're really talking about embedded cultural change in people's practices as consumers, as businessmen, as policymakers, as politicians. And I think if you overlook that, then the effectiveness of the tools as a whole becomes much less, because this is a long-term change. If we're going to go down this route as a way to try and change the food system rather than regulation or dictatorship or whatever you like. It's an option. Okay. Yeah, I think so as well. And I think I'll leave it at that, because I was going to talk, there's 2 tools to help to try and raise best practice and get people to learn from both good practice of these urban food strategy tools, but also the bad cases. I think you can learn as much from initiatives that have gone wrong as you can from those that have gone right. And Sustainable Cities Network is particularly effective in bringing people together, slightly technology oriented, in that it's online, there's a wealth of resources and ways of communicating between groups around the UK. And just a quick plug for something that we've been doing in the Food Smart Cities project, which was an online course for individuals interested in cities, issues about food in the city. It's just coming to an end. We have 350 participants who signed up for the course, but we could have had a lot more. There was a lot of demand for this course, but we had to close it for technical reasons. And my point there is, I think there's a massive knowledge gap of people asking questions out, both at grassroots levels, policy level, academic level, and that's something that's incumbent on us as academics and policymakers to try and fill, because there's a lot of interest in this area. And I'll end it there. Thank you.